Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the keynote lecture of our Summer Magi Conference, exploring the question, what is life? I'm Jesse Taylor, a physicist at St. Joe's University down the street, and the director of the Magi Project. The Magi Project exists at the intersection between science, religion, and philosophy, and exists to works to facilitate dialogue across these disciplines. Through public talks, courses, conferences like this one, and various other outreach, we invite students, faculty, anyone who else who may be interested, join in conversations about fundamental questions of the universe and our place within it through the distinct but complementary approaches of science, philosophy, and religion. This conference comes out of the direct outgrowth of our commitment to conversation. We're exploring 6 sub-questions across tonight and the next several days. And in our sessions tomorrow and on Saturday, we'll be exploring them via intentional interdisciplinary dialogue. As our conference speakers, scientists and theologians and philosophers engage in conversation. I'm really excited to see where these conversations take us. The major question which should for it, of course, what is life, which is way too broad to cover in one weekend. But to kind of frame it a little bit, across many fields, cutting-edge research may be moving some of the boundaries that historically seem significant when you think about what is life. For instance, as we'll hear in our first 2 sessions tomorrow, serious scientists are beginning to look for life outside Earth. So we may not live in a special place, and animals come achingly close to having language. So we may not be able to hear either. Across disciplines, these fundamental research is happening that raises profound questions and has implications for our understanding of life, ourselves, and our place in the universe. And so through our conversations, tonight and the next couple of days, we'll begin to understand and develop those implications. I'd like to thank the John Fulton Foundation for their support through the grant for Women supporting the Catholic intellectual tradition, and the Program for Research and Urban Civil Society here at Kent for making this conference possible. Also, just the logistical notes. Everyone's got these conference readers. They have pieces from all of our speakers in it, so you can kind of see what alignments they're going to be making in their sessions. At the very back of the reader, there's a schedule for the conference, so you can see what time things are, and there's also where the sessions are taking place. So this is our only event here at the Sheraton. Tomorrow will be at Houston Hall, and on Saturday we'll be at the Women's Center. Both of those are a couple blocks away. From here, and there's a map that shows you where you're going. So I'll see you there. Tomorrow we'll see you at Houston Hall. And with that, let me invite up Dr. Dylan Brown to introduce our keynote speaker.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. And let me first of all thank you. I think give thanks. Say thank you to the Collegiate Institute for giving me the opportunity to participate in this conference and to introduce tonight's speaker. It is a special treat and honor for me to do so, since Dr. Deane-Drummond is by all means one of the main reasons I am here tonight. When she was at the University of Notre Dame, she offered me a position as a PhD in one of her interdisciplinary research projects, one of many projects, on human wisdom and human origins. And the project thoroughly changed my own trajectory as a scholar. And for this and for serving on my dissertation committee as well, I owe her a deep debt of gratitude. So, a few words about Dr. Deane-Drummond. After completing her first PhD in plant physiology at the University of Reading, Dr. Deane-Drummond eventually migrated to theology and completed a second PhD at the University of Manchester. She has since published hundreds of articles, scholarly articles, and book chapters, and either edited or written as a single author of 20 scholarly books. Her research focuses on the interface between theology and the sciences, including ecology, anthropology, evolution, animal studies, psychology, and genetics. She has tackled ethical issues including bioethics, environmental ethics, animal ethics, and transhumanism. Since I've come to know Dr. Deane-Drummond personally, since 2015, she founded the Center at Notre Dame University, where she oversaw multiple projects, interdisciplinary projects. In 2019, she became the inaugural director of the Laudato Si Research Institute at Campion Hall, Oxford, where she is also a research fellow in theology. In the same time period, she authored the first 2 volumes of her current trilogy with Oxford University Press, a shorter introductory text on ecological theology, multiple articles, and a handful more edited volumes. Her previous books include, among others, Christ and Evolution, which is 2009, and Genetics and Christian Ethics in 2006. Finally, Dr. Deane-Drummond is also the editor of International Journal of Philosophy, Theology, and Sciences. So she's mildly accomplished, you know. As someone who currently works at the interface of science, theology, and philosophy, I've only grown a deep admiration for Dr. Deane-Drummond's interdisciplinary and creative scholarship. Mastering cutting-edge scientific scholarship and deploying it in genuinely interesting and constructive theological ways is a very difficult task. Dr. Deane-Drummond is by all means a pioneer of this regard, and is currently one of the most important living Catholic theologians. As for today's lecture, I am sure that we are in for a bold and creative feast. The title of the lecture is The Theological Exploration of Human Becoming, Belonging to This World and the Next. So, if you would join me in welcoming Dr. Deane-Drummond.
Do I say after that such generous introduction? Thank you so much, Dylan, for supporting me as well in what you did today. It would have been insane without the team of people, including the extremely bright students that we had working with us on that project. But, I'm here really to thank the Theological Institute and Jessie Taylor in particular for the invitation to be here tonight. I'm going to begin in the context of the Magi, which is really, I know, the title of the whole series, but I thought it would be interesting to think about how that particular seems to be moving forward. And personally, it's a very remote.
The up arrow. Try the up arrow on the keyboard.
I am doing that.
Okay.
Anyway, I will continue. In the context of the Magi, the reason why it's interesting to me to situate what is like in that context is that I work at a Jesuit college at Campion Hall, as been named briefly. But Campion Hall, which is Jesuit, is also indebted to Ignatius of Loyola. We believed, or we spoke about in the spiritual exercises, of the need always to do more for Christ and more in service of others. And if we're down arrow. Oh, okay. Sorry, I was pressing the wrong arrow. So I've never had a down arrow before to advanced slides. Anyway, so I can't make the excuse of jet lag for that. Yes. So what about more in the service of others and more in the service of Christ? And I'm showing you an image here of the photograph I took at Loyola itself, where there was a major conference here in April. It's the place where Ignatius of Loyola was believed to have been converted to Christianity and to again establish the Ignatian order. And he had a cannonball which struck his leg in a battle, and he spent hours reading the Bible and other things, and suddenly he started thinking, I want to do the more for Christ, the more for others. So that idea of conversion is, I think, very interesting in the sense that it's about our human life, but it's something about the more. It's something about thinking not just about what's good in this world and our materiality, but it's something else that he was reaching out towards. At the same time, that more should be thought of as requiring humility. It's not just about the best, it's about being better at what we do. And so more to the glory of God. And so there's an orientation there towards the transcendent. Well, where does that orientation to the transcendent come from? Where does that instinct towards the unseen, the divine, think about what is, if you like, in this world, but somehow beyond it at the same time, and yet orientated to the next. How can we think about those things in terms of our humanity? So the human being is the only creature on this earth that asks, what is life? And that's why initiating this collection of talks and things on what it means to be human, I think is a reasonably worthy one to start with, because we're the only creatures that can ask that question. And it also means then, what is humanity? And so it takes us to theological anthropology and what it means to be human. The book that I wrote about 8 years ago called The Wisdom of the Liminal, Evolution and Other Animals in Human Becoming, I talked about humanity as being a borderland species. A borderland in relation to our animality, but also at the same time, and simultaneously with that, a borderland in relation to transcendence and that instinct for transcendence. So that transcendence isn't in the sense of being detached from this world, but somehow we're reaching out to the beyond, even as we're embedded within it. And so we're starting to perceive the world differently from other creatures. It's another dimension, not restricted necessarily to what can be discovered in the empirical sciences. But even those sciences are also theory-laden, and some would say value-laden as well. As it's value-laden in the sense that it takes its bearings from Western philosophies in a way that perhaps it hasn't even recognized itself. I think biologists and geneticists are some of the hardest to convince of another world. And I'll give you an example of this recently. I know there are some geneticists in this audience who are actually also going to speak, and I really congratulate you on swimming against the tide. Because I was at a symposium at Harvard University recently. I won't give away any names, but one or two of the biologists there decided that any association with any science and religion publication was going to be very uncomfortable for them, because somehow it then acknowledged that a subject, an academic subject, coming from a base stance, that is theology, was an acceptable one for an academic to do. So at the same time, they were also quite happy, of course, to take Templeton funding. So there was some sort of disjointed thing going on there, but at the same time, they wanted to be honest, and this was, as they said afterwards, the elephant in the room that no one dared to speak. And the question is, I'm not going to ask whether there are any other elephants in this room, but that would be too rude. But at the same time, I think that the history of the university itself across the world is often premised on a faith-based position. We have to say to ourselves, is this attitude a peculiarly modern one of humanity? The secularism predicted by religious studies scholars about 20 years ago has never really materialized. The world is still about 85% religious. So it's persisted. This instinct for religion has persisted, regardless of the fact that we're living in a scientific age. And it's that dialectic between knowing and trying to understand the transcendent, and yet understanding ourselves as scientific and knowledgeable in the sciences is the paradox in which we're living in the 21st century. Charles Taylor wrote a book called The Sources of the Self not so long ago, where he talked about the porous and the buffered self. In the porous self, which was pre-modern, the relationship between the self and the world was open to external forces. So we understood ourselves as being subject somehow to the work of angels or the work of demons. But in this buffered self of humanity, each person seems to be self-contained, shielded from external influences. But we've forgotten that relatively recent history, and I would say that we've also forgotten our deep history as well. And it's that forgetting the deep history that I want to talk about tonight. The liminal then traces back to our forgotten aspects of our human being and becoming. And this is an example where a really incredible symposium that I was part of and even instigated with Augustine Fuentes, who is an anthropologist, that took place in South Africa at the Institute of Advanced Study at Stellenbosch University. And as you can see from the title, it was called Wisdom, Humility and Grace in Deep Time. The paleoanthropologists who were there had never met any theologians before in many cases. But after a day or so, they actually began to think that we were worth talking to and even inspired some of their new ideas. It took time to build up that trust. Wisdom for them became an operational way of seeing the world in that it became symbolic. So they're influenced here by Charles Peirce and Peirce, the philosopher, and others. But with humility, they struggled a bit more to understand what this might mean from their point of view. But in the end, they thought, well, maybe it's something to do with the way tools are used. If you're not kind of self-contained in some way when you use your tools or able to submit to others, then you won't be able to do the kinds of tools that are extremely sophisticated. And I'll show you a few examples of those tools a bit later in this talk. But when it came to grace, that was a real stumbling block. Didn't quite know how to understand grace from a scientific point of view. But the reason it was there was deliberate on my part. I said to Augustine Fuentes, we need a provocation. It's too easy in science and religion dialogue meetings to find areas of consonance where the areas of dissonance are not recognized and not even there as a way of, if you like, enabling the pearl in the oyster shell to become what it needs to become. So in other words, we took a risk of asking questions about something that was very deep for theologians, but something very difficult to understand in terms of what it means to the human in the Paleolithic. But it raised the importance of the sacred for all human becoming. And as I'll give you an example, as I give you some more examples of why I think that's fundamentally important. And it also led to some honest exchanges about our different starting points, also areas that we had in common. At the same time, that dialogue is also an important reminder of what it means to become human. So to get on with the actual lecture itself then, what is human life? I'm going to begin by talking briefly about some contested theories in evolution, in human evolution in particular, is relevant to that. And then the second part, I'm going to explore our moral becoming, because both of those aspects, I think, are fundamental to understanding what it means to be a human, fully human life. And the focus that I will give there is on compassion and humility, even though I've written on wisdom for many years, and I can talk about that in the question. It's in compassion and wisdom that I think we find some interesting examples of where the material record and our own understanding theologically can start to have some kind of discussion. But the question on the transcendent and what it means to reach towards what is not there in terms of the visible material universe, that question of how we discover that is woven into everything I'm going to say tonight. So that's, if you like, the big question that's underlying all these other aspects. And I'm going to give one or two examples of very early human practices where there are hints that something like that reach towards the transcendent is present. So how it is that we belong to this world and also the next. And I'm going to situate the contemporary evolution discussion in the context of a brief historical take from a historian called Philip Sloan. He believes that Darwinian theory has its background in what he calls natural history realism. And so he objects to the application of Charles Darwin to human subjects, particularly his book, The Descent of Man. Natural history realism is observational. That is, it's about how we observe the world, but it makes some assumptions that we have direct access to the world's structure. It's also very descriptive, and he calls optimistic. In other words, we're sure that we know what we're seeing. What it doesn't seem to do is take a sufficient account of subjectivity, of human subjectivity. We all know that, or we've discovered, that Darwin resists splitting apart reason and instinct, or free will and determinism. And he also is troublesome for those who think about humanity in terms of our uniqueness or maybe even superiority. But one of the big challenges for Charles Darwin that he admitted himself was the moral sense. How do you explain the moral sense? And he says this, it has caused me much labour. And that's a bit of an understatement. He couldn't really work it out. And the leap that Darwin seems to be forced to make was that the difference between animals, other animals that is, and humanity, in many respects like this, is a matter of analogies rather than homologies. Analogies are where there are there's commonality, but their root or their origin is very different. So you might, with a homologous relationship, the flipper of a whale would be the same as a forelimb of a human being or an animal, for example. Whereas when they're common functions, they are analogies. And then to quote now from Philip Sloan. He says, he urges focusing on the experience of ourselves both as existentially existent, conscious and self-reflective beings, to grant full reality to our pre-philosophical experience as human beings in the world, a reality that stands prior to our scientific rationalization about our origins, or to causal explanations of human experience that then might be supplied by the natural sciences. What he's trying to do is to get back to what happened even before scientists started thinking about what is life, or even theologians for that matter. The newer theories, however, soften some of the deterministic elements that Sloan picks up in Darwinian theory. And the systems approach also contrasts with the more individual survival narrative that we find in Darwin's the survival, theory of evolution by natural selection. The niche construction theory is in the middle between the systems theory and what we call standard evolutionary theory, or SET. And the reason why it's interesting is, whoops, I should go to the next slide. The reason why this is interesting is that there's a development within evolutionary theories, so that you have a debate internally within the two. There's a tendency amongst theologians and philosophers, for that matter, just to concentrate on Charles Darwin and not realize the rich debate that's going on even within the natural sciences. And I think we have to try and understand those debates if we're going to situate the dialogue in any kind of sophisticated way. So Susan Oyama challenges then the cause and effect of single units that's built into the standard evolutionary theory. And she's one of the advocates for the development systems theory. For her, we have, if you like, read the gene in a homoploid way. This is what she says. There is no central organizer, no repository of goals or instructions, no prime movers. All those kinds of ideas amount to what she calls the homoploid gene. It's all the marshals. So a reading of the gene as if it was an extension of our humanity. That's basically what that means. But between standard evolutionary theory and developmental systems theory is something else which I find the most interesting, and that's the extended evolutionary synthesis theory. It's dynamic and relational, a different understanding of evolution that allows us to think about sophisticated change going on, but not confine it just to tying it into genetic determinisms. So let me give an example from Kevin Leyland. He looks at some fish species called chichlids. Biologists among you can forgive me if I'm mispronouncing it. And he's compared the ones in Lake Tanganyika to those in Lake Malawi. And he finds that some of their characteristics, such as large fleshy lips, for example, protruding forehead or lower jaw, which can be short and quite stubby, they're very similar to those in Lake Malawi. Their genetic origin is completely dissimilar. So why is this taking place? According to standard evolutionary theory, it's a matter of natural selection and chance. But according to the extended evolutionary synthesis theory, this is unreasonable. So this is what he says. This account requires extraordinary coincidence to explain the multiple parallel forms that evolve independently in each lake. Instead, the development bias guides gene pathways down specific routes that are then opened up by development. So the standard Evo-Devo for those doing this way of thinking. At the same time, the developmental process is active, and this is where it gets even more interesting for me. So there's a creative element demarking which forms and features evolve, and hence accounting for why organisms possess the characteristics they do. There's a sense in which organisms themselves are, in some sense, shaping their own evolution through where they go, what they do, how they behave, and so on. So there's a tying in of one and the other. The sort of single tramway then from gene to what we find is not really accepted in this model. It's much more dynamic. Not ignoring the role of genes, it's just it's qualified now in a slightly different way. Tim Ingold is even more fundamentally critical of standard evolutionary theory. And he rejects the assumption that's often taken for granted that the information flow is from gene to life. For him, it's not related to the way actual life works. Humanity then, in my own way of thinking as well, is open to the ecological community in a multi-species commons. And in this sense, our identity then is in relation to the community around us, not just the human community, but also the community of other creatures that go up to make the ecological context in which we live. Ingold rejects sociobiology because for him, quote, there's no space for real people. So he rejects, therefore, any rigid parallels in cultural evolution between the genetic and social life, because he believes it disguises real differences. And so we need to move towards what he calls relationships thinking, where humanity is not just animal plus. So he rejects then the split of the cultural from the biological, the moral from animality, and so on and so forth. Has he gone too far or not? This is something I'd like us to think about maybe in question time. At the same time, he says, a good deal of the popular interest directed towards the contemporary populations of hunters and gatherers can be put down to the wholly mistaken notion that they're living exemplars of a prototypical humanity, a childhood of man from which the rest of us has grown up. So he's rejecting then this sort of progressive understanding of our human evolution, that is where prototypes are found in hunter-gatherer societies. And not only is that insulting for those who are living in these kinds of communities that have themselves evolved over millions of years, it's also not the appropriate way of trying to understand our humanity. And this is because biological nature is not uniform. It's instead, it has intra and interspecies variability. So he's prepared to consider what you might call bottom-up or a Lamarckian approach to complement or rather to undo some of the deterministic elements in evolutionary psychology. It does postulate the vital force, but he sort of steps back a little bit from, well, certainly doesn't endorse vitalism. Vitalism was an idea common around the time of Darwin that proposed a force in addition to that of, or instead of, natural selection. It was a much weaker understanding of why things change. At the same time, mechanistic science for him is also not true to life. So we're raising up the ancient or the old question then, is what is life? It challenges then Richard Dawkins' view that Darwin's theory explains life. It gives an idea of what life is like, but it doesn't really explain it. There are other areas which you need to try and understand, especially related to the idea of form. We need to understand what form is, in other words, through processes like epigenetics. What are those proximate causes? What are the proximate causes that are then contributing rather than just the ultimate causes, some geneticists like to call it, in the gene, and so on. So he says, therefore, that evolution is, quote, more like an exploration over time of the transformative potentials of a total generative system. So he's coming closer to the sort of systems theory that I mentioned earlier. We're not quite getting there. So the genotype plus phenotype in his thinking misses out the physiological processes that constitute life itself. So in Ingalls' definition of life, it is a name for what is going on in the generative field within which organic forms are located and held in place. I think that's a very interesting example, because not only because I was a plant physiologist by training, and I always felt that those who are working in molecular biology is getting too much attention, but also because I think what he's trying to do is to say it's much more complicated than you might think. So we're trying to attach ourselves to individual processes without really looking at the whole sufficiently. In Darwinian theory, in his understanding, organisms are beings that express a pre-formed project that's then subject to external circumstances. Whereas the extended evolutionary synthesis theory, the kind of theory that Tim Ingold is proposing, is it's much more complicated than that. So what he's trying to do then is see that embodiment, that movement through time, where each part enfolds the whole, and the organic and the environment are intertwined with each other rather than separated. Let's give a summary so far then. I think Ingold raises some important critiques of Charles Darwin's view, but does his process view lack specificity, especially that related to the moral life? It's fairly generalized emergence, where the variables do not take into account the radical encounter with the transcendent that I'm trying to speak of in this lecture. So I admire a lot of what he's trying to do in terms of internally critiquing the Darwinian solutions, as it were, that he thinks are too simplistic. At the same time, he's missed out something, I think, which is very important. And so the second half of my talk today is then to look at some, again, concrete examples where we start to think more about the moral life and its origins in the human sphere. And Penny Spikins is someone I've started working with quite closely since I've returned to England. And her thesis, and again, she's not religious at all, but she believes that compassion is fundamental to the lives of early humans. And long-term compassion can be traced to care for the ill and injured very, very far back in deep human history. Short-term compassion and empathy is found in many other animals, so it's not like it doesn't exist, but it's the long-term and in very difficult situations that humanity seems to be capable of sustaining. And she tries to reconstruct our emotions in prehistory, which is unusual for an anthropologist, especially a paleoanthropologist, because normally what they do is try and track things in the material record, but they don't want to think about what those human beings actually felt and did and perceived. It's too difficult to make sense of. So they ignore the inner emotional life. You might think, well, how on earth can it be traced? How can we really get any kind of inference? What she's done is she's found some very striking examples in the literature and in her own work that points to a different way of thinking about this problem. First of all, understanding the evolution and the role of compassion in past human societies entails recognizing that compassion is more than just a feeling that we recognize as personal, and this is Penny Spikins speaking, but also in a wider analytical perspective, it is a biological response, a motivation to act whose roots lie in the hormonal and neuronal working of our mind. So in other words, she's still wanting to think about it scientifically, but she wants to also try and trace it back into deep time as well. So compassion then is an initial step, where compassion has an initial step in empathy, and then there is a deep, strong motivation to help. And what are these examples that she comes up with? You might say, well, I don't understand how this possibly come to anything. Here's the first one. The most well-known example, this again is her speaking, the most well-known early example of long-term support for an incapacitated individual comes from KNMER 1808, a female Homo ergaster dated to around 1.5 million years ago. Think of that, 1.5 million years ago, way earlier than Homo sapiens. Examinations of the skeletal remains of this individual have led to the suggestion that she was suffering from hypovitaminosis A, a disease caused by excessive intake of vitamin A. So they can trace the symptoms in the bones because there's a reduction in bone density in a particular way, and there's also coarse bone growth. So they know full well that this individual had vitaminosis well. So and that hypervitaminosis A is a pathology that takes months and months, and so to develop, and so the care must have been over the long term. So this disease isn't just to make someone ill for a few weeks; it lasts for months and months and months. The second example, 1.77 million years ago, is from the Demantici archaeological dig in Georgia. And she says this: one of the Demantici hominids had lost all but one tooth, and the skull here isn't that particular one. I can't get hold of that one. With all the sockets except for the canine teeth having been reabsorbed. Since it could only, or she or he could only have consumed soft plant or animal foods, it seems likely that it would have needed support from others. So it's an inference, and those individuals were severely incapacitated. Let's go for a third example. It's a bit closer to Homo sapiens. These are the Neanderthals, and they're concurrent with our species. That is, they lived around the same kind of time. Shanidar 1, the old man of Shanidar, dating to around 60 to 80,000 years ago, is perhaps one of the best known examples. This individual suffered multiple fractures across his body, with the right side being particularly badly affected, the right arm being described as completely withered. The individual also received a crushing injury to his cranium, possibly causing blindness in his left eye due to the deformity of the skull. He's in a pretty bad way, right, by any account. So, why did these individuals survive? They must have been cared for by others. In addition, the bone investigation shows that the injuries that this individual suffered happened under adolescence, whereas this individual died at between age 35 to 50. So it was a ripe old age for Neanderthals. So that this individual had been cared for from adolescence right through to an old age. Again, contributing very little to the community, having to be dependent on the others. There's another really interesting and striking example that she quotes from the Middle Pleistocene. A child between 5 and 8 years old who suffered from a birth defect in the cranium, called craniosynostosis. That's pronounced correctly. But in this was a very severe birth defect of the cranium. And it would mean that this individual was almost completely incapacitated. But babies in modern societies, that is from middle age onwards, were abandoned with this disease because they found them in graveyards across, certainly in the UK. So what's going on? It seemed that this child was cared for between the 5, again, until they died of natural causes, whereas in modern societies they were just abandoned because the defect was so extreme. So she believes then that it's a combination of cognitive, social, and ecological components that interact in a complex way, so that compassion starts to be extended to these vulnerable others, but also extended perhaps to other objects as well, And it seems to be quite different from someone like Martin Nussbaum, for example, who's a philosopher who understood compassion as closely connected with the cognitive component. So she talks about, this is Martin Nussbaum, as being related to size. Something is very serious, something is non-desert, it should not have happened, and something is related to flourishing, your well-being matters to mine. But how did all these different elements of compassion that Martin Nussbaum talks about surface? What we find here then is an inevitable gap between what Penny Spikins talks about when she talks about compassion and what philosophers would like to talk about in compassion, and what theologians might talk about when you're in dialogue with philosophers and others. There's still a gap. At the same time, there's something going on in early human history that we need to think through. The idea that compassion simply strengthens community bonds or some sort of reputation, that is, it enhances the reputation of the individuals who are compassionate, doesn't seem to be particularly convincing. Was compassion also in some way related to a nascent perception of the transcendent? Certainly, if we understand God as a punishing God, or simply a punishing God and nothing else, which is what some evolutionary biologists like Dominic Johnson have suggested, in that particular case, then a punitive God wouldn't be expected to enhance or encourage compassion. But what if the divine was understood as a compassionate other, and these extreme expressions of compassion were somehow inspired by that sense of that transcendent one who is also the divine one who is loving and compassionate? We don't know the answers to these questions, whereas we can speculate. At the same time, we should get away from any sense of a romantic, idyllic, peaceful early societies. They were also violent in many respects. And there were peculiarly human forms of cruelty were possible for these individuals as well. What other indicators might point to this idea of transcendence? And I'm going to go through a few of these quite quickly. First of all, beautiful hand axes. This one, which is the West Trops hand axe, 250,000 years ago, is crafted around a fossil of a scallop shell. Was it about how others think about this individual? Is that why they made this incredibly beautiful hand axe? It certainly didn't require it to function in the right kind of way. They may have viewed it as living as well. They might have seen it as something implicit in the material they tried to draw out. We don't really know why it happened. But what was really clear is that it was very high in symmetry. And it also takes hundreds and hundreds of hours of practice. Penny Spikins tells me about how some of her students practice making axes and other stone tools. And it's actually extremely difficult, and they start to realize how incredibly intelligent these Neanderthal and others must have been. It's actually extremely difficult and also very, very patient. It requires then so many hours of practice that Dietrich Stout says the following: discovery of optimal technologies might be facilitated by social scaffolding, explicit instruction, or high fidelity imitation of an expert model, but minimally requires focused attention, self-monitoring, and inhibition of automatic reactions during repetitive practice. We arrived then to what's sometimes called man the toolmaker, But it doesn't really explain the morphological changes that have happened in these different axes and tools, because they're all equally multifunctional. Also, the enhancement of personal qualities such as self-control or ability to imagine alternatives and so on, in some ways points to the possibility of humility. That is, where there's a prerequisite of some kind of self-restraint in relation to others, especially if you're imitating these axes and replicating. Many of these are replicated over generations and generations, but then occasionally you get this novelty and this extraordinary outgrowing aesthetic beauty in some of these examples. Humility was rejected by Nietzsche in the 19th century, or even David Hume in the 18th century, as some kind of monkish virtue, which he called rejected by any men of sense, as he called it. And the reason is this: they serve no manner of purpose, neither to advance man's fortune in the world, nor render him a more valuable member of society. But in addition, they stupefy the understanding and harden the heart, obscure the fancy and sour the temper. He continues further that they place them in the catalogue of vices. So he's extremely hostile towards anything like humility, as well as other aspects such as self-denial, silence, solitude, and what he calls the whole train of monkish virtues. What we have to ask ourselves is, were they right? Wasn't this idea of self-restraint, silence, etc., part of our human becoming that we need to take into account? Yuval Noah Harari, his rather renowned book, Homo Deus, believes that the achievements of human history were a kind of anti-humility, an aggressive attempt to be divine. Homo Deus is poised now to lose control of its own devices. Rather weakly, he says that compassion for other animals might be meted out on us by our AI creations. In other words, it might be meted out on us by our AI creations to show compassion to us if we then show compassion to other animals. Rather a sort of analogous way to the way Aquinas sometimes talks about why we need to show compassion. And that's rather irrelevant aside. But the point is that he has this understanding, which is almost the whole opposite of anything that you find in early human history. The progressive, almost a logarithmic account of human history doesn't bear any resemblance to what anthropologists seem to be finding in the early human record. Aquinas, on the other hand, believes that humility required or encouraged the right relationship to self and others, including God, but also the moral life as a whole required the exercise of right reason over our passions and desires. And so the importance of self-control, but at the same time, he didn't reject the idea of emotion. But the ability to be self-regulating and sensitive to another is important for him. And humility is also important, not only because it seems to prepare the ground to receive grace, but also because it expels pride. And pride gets in the way of that reception of divine grace. So you could say that it's fundamental as a preparation ground before we can even think about the concept of the transcendent, which is why I put humility in here as one of what you might call virtues relevant for thinking about why humanity, or how it is that humanity became this transcendent being. What about other ancient practices? Again, probably getting close to where I should have ended by now. but I'm going to mention one other example, and that is Homo naledi. And the reason why Homo, and that was came up in the South African meeting I talked to you about. Homo naledi is a really fascinating hominin because it overlaps with Homo sapiens and was discovered some time ago in the group of archaeologists, which included led by Lee Berger and John Hawkes. And the reason why it's remarkable is that its morphology implies that it's about 1.5 million years ago, but direct dating in the rising star cave where it was discovered is that it was between 236 and 355,000 years ago. So really the late and middle Pleistocene. So it's contemporary with Homo sapiens, but its morphology in terms of its brain size is remarkably small. And these are what they discovered in this cave is 15 individuals and 1,500 fossil remains, which is the largest collection of a single species of a close relative ever been found. And so it's possible that this species could also be responsible for some of the Acheulean or the Middle Stone tools. Because we don't know, we find these tools and we just assume it's Homo sapiens, but it might have, Homo naledi might have been responsible. The anatomy was one then, as I said, it was small-brained, it walked upright, and so it rejects that theory that as we get progressively more human, we get bigger and bigger brains. In fact, what's been found recently is our brain sizes are becoming smaller, but to become more dependent on technology. But that's the side of the point. So the small brain was the size of Australopithecus. So the stature of the lower limb and the foot was the same as Homo sapiens. The wrist, hand, and fingertips were like Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. And it also, so it seemed very likely that it had the capability of making tools, and it had small dentition, which means that it ate meat or he or she ate meat and plants. But the mortuary practices are the most remarkable, because in this Lassetti chamber, deep inside a cave, down a very, very narrow chute, and again, I can talk about this in the questions, was found these remarkable remains of individuals lined up in specific places. So they were deliberately buried there. They weren't just suddenly thrown there by someone else, maybe in Homo sapiens or by carnivores. They were lined up in a particular way, and it was almost impossible to access this cave, which is why it's only been discovered in the last 5 or 10 years or so, 5 years or so. What can we say about this being then, this Homo naledi? Certainly they believed that the dead were worthy of respect. It was a dawning of a spiritual consciousness before even religious practices. It may even have contributed to our lineage if we cross-mated with that. We don't know. We found that for Neanderthals. So Neanderthals used to be thought of as this brutal species, but actually most of us got Neanderthal DNA in us. So let me just finally then, because I'm getting a bit tired, I'm going to read this last concluding paragraph. That's going to be it. Okay, so we arrive at more questions about what it means to be human in relation to theological understanding and answers. How is human becoming moved from careful burial practices in that tiny, small-brained Homo naledi the sophistication of more abstract composition in the theological reflection of Thomas Aquinas. And there's a, you can see on this left-hand side of this slide, that tiny little brain, which Lee Berger is holding up. I've argued in this lecture that understanding our humanity in terms of liminality, in relation to our animality and transcendence, counters any position that human life is simply about factual aspects of our biological existence. Understanding human life in a dynamic relationship with other beings, including the more mysterious unseen, begins to open up rich processes of human becoming. So instead of understanding a sense of the transcendent as an add-on arising from belief in a punitive God, as some evolutionary explanations of religion have suggested, human life unfolds even as it enfolds other beings, becoming moral through enhanced practices of compassion and humility, to name just two dispositions. The possibility of any moral becoming should not be understood as unidirectional, but akin to the ancient practice of wayfaring. The threat of sinking deeper into vice and other forms of violence exists even as humanity has the ability to become more compassionate, tolerant, grateful, and so on. I've stressed in this lecture more positive attributes, not least because there's a tendency to imagine our ancient past as simply brutally violent. As ancient theologians and philosophers have stressed for centuries, a distinctively human life is a mixture of tendencies for deep compassion or abject cruelty. Understanding human belonging is orientated towards the next, if understood in the light of belief in a loving and compassionate God, would arguably enhance tendencies towards compassion in this life rather than its opposite. And some fascinating examples of tool use, deliberate ancient burials among hominids living in the same era as Homo sapiens, along with their relatively small brains, points to a transcendent sense of belonging to the next world being coincidence with earliest human becoming, rather than added on much later in human history with the development of religious rituals. Thank you so much for your patience. I'm now finished. Thank you.